Hi, everyone. Welcome to our briefing today, Keeping It Cool, International Efforts to Reduce Emissions from Refrigerants. I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. And this is the second of three briefings this week in our series, What Congress Needs to Know About COP30. EESI was founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we have worked to provide information about environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. We do our best to ensure that our resources are always timely, relevant, accessible, and practical. We put a lot of thought into making sure how our resources can be available before congressional staff even realize they need them. The best way to keep up with everything we do at EESI is to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. You can also follow us on Blue Sky and Instagram and other social media platforms at EESI Online. That way, you'll never miss any of our great resources. And as far as COP30 is concerned, we have a daily newsletter, COP30 Dispatch, which is a must-read resource to help you follow developments in Brazil. You can subscribe for COP30 Dispatch, for Climate Change Solutions, and see all of our other resources online at www.eesi.org. The first briefing in our series was yesterday, and we talked with two experts about the process and expectations for the negotiations this year at COP30. I'll not recap too much of that briefing because if you missed it, the best thing to do would be to just watch the briefing, and you can do that on our website. But the biggest thing we talked about is the lack of an official U.S. federal administration presence at the negotiations. Some of that space in that vacuum will be taken up by states and local governments. Some of it will be taken up by businesses. And a congressional presence is unfortunately less likely now because of the ongoing lapse in appropriations. But there will be absolutely a U.S. presence at COP, even if it isn't the State Department, an official State Department-led delegation. But that topic was yesterday. Today, our briefing is about a different topic, the Global Cooling Pledge, and tomorrow we'll be looking at international trade and climate policy. But today, the Global Cooling Pledge will be our topic, and that is something that we're covering because we expect it to make some headlines at COP30 as participating countries and supportive businesses continue to make progress on protecting people from excessive heat through advanced technologies, energy efficiency, and resilience measures while avoiding the release of superpolluting hydrofluorocarbons. We have a survey that we'll put up here in just a second. We'll also have this at the end of the briefing. If people in our online audience would like to share comments about the briefing today, we'd really appreciate that. We read every response. You can use this QR code or the link to do that. We have three tremendous panelists, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. I give you a couple different options to ask questions. The first thing you can do is you can use this Mentimeter QR code. You can also go to www.menti.com and use the 8-digit code that's on the screen. We'll keep this displayed here for a couple seconds to give you time to do that, to log in and use the code. If you submit a question using the Mentimeter, they'll be anonymous and they'll kind of come in and they get put into this big pool, and we'll look at all the different questions that come in and we'll try to come up with a good question that we can interject into the Q&A and get our comments from our panelists. You can also send us an email, and the email address to use is ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org. We'll do our best to incorporate your questions into the Q&A, regardless of how you submit them. And we'll also be doing real-time coverage of the briefing today on Blue Sky and Instagram. Our handle is at EESI Online, and that's another way you can ask questions as well. All right, so we have a tremendous panel. And it's my privilege to introduce the first of our panelists today. Lily Riahi heads the UN Environment Programme's Cool Coalition, an official outcome of the 2019 UN Climate Action, and the Secretariat of the Global Cooling Pledge launched at COP28 with 72 countries. The coalition supports governments' transition to efficient, climate-friendly cooling through a holistic approach to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Lily also oversees the urban energy portfolio at UNEP, supporting countries and cities working to optimize the use of distributed energy at the building and neighborhood level to achieve net zero buildings and energy transition targets. Lily, thank you so much for joining us in our briefing today. I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much, Daniel, and all colleagues for inviting me here today to speak about how we can keep it cool without driving emissions. As you mentioned, my name is Lily Riahi, and I'm heading the UNEP-led Cool Coalition. Next slide, please. And this is a community of around 250 members in 80 countries who, as Daniel already said, are working to comprehensively deliver action on sustainable cooling, delivering on development goals, climate goals, and the Kigali Amendment. We're operating through 3 interconnected areas of work, and first is on advocacy. So we build the efforts to raise ambition on cooling through a shared narrative and sort of evidence-based advocacy. We then develop the science, and not just to share knowledge, but also to create credible experience-based policy advice that is developed with countries and also with experts from around the world, and that set benchmarks for policy. And then we implement that science through catalytic projects and joint technical assistance. So these pillars of action, they create sort of an ecosystem that allows us to move from ambition to action, from sort of research to results. And that's a little bit the story of the Global Cooling Pledge, which we will discuss today. And to share some information about the Global Cooling Pledge, I'll start by presenting the findings of our Global Cooling Watch report, launched in 2023 at UNEP. It was developed with over 50 experts, scientists contributing from all over the world, including many in the United States, and it provides us a pathway to answer what many countries and people are asking, which is how to keep cool, as we said, without driving emissions. Next slide, please. So one of the first things to note is that globally, cooling currently requires 20% of electricity use globally. This is a number that I think doesn't get spoken about enough. And what our report found was that without any further action beyond what is happening now, so there are market improvements on efficiency, there is commitments to phase down refrigerants, but even with those things, without any additional actions, the demand for cooling equipment will skyrocket. It will be tripling by 2050. And this will then double our electricity consumption. And this is normal, next slide, of course, because we need cooling. We need cooling for nutrition. We need it for our food systems to keep food fresh, and accessible through cold chains, to make sure they're delivered from farm to fork. We need to protect people from the impacts of extreme heat. We need to keep ourselves safe, to be able to work and to learn in comfortable environments. We need cooling to keep vaccines viable. So it's normal that the demand for cooling is growing, considering its important role in our societies. But it is a bit of a double burden because it consumes so much electricity, often because of inefficient technologies. Often those technologies are in poorly designed buildings, and the equipment may use, refrigerants that are very strong greenhouse gases. So next slide, please. That's why in the report, we modeled a pathway to the future. And what you see in the middle is how our cooling emissions are growing if we continue with business as usual, as I've said so far, but also while providing access to everybody. It's really important to say that, because as we're facing heat around the world, it's really important that every small community, whether they're low income, whether they're vulnerable communities, care centers, all around the world are able to access and be safe, access cooling and be safe. And so what you see is that taking all of that into account, we reach the middle bar. So you see all these bars on the slide. Mainly the middle blue bar is what you see of where we'll get with emissions by 2050, which is about 6.1 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, 10% of global projected emissions in 2050, if we just continue as we are. But if we then, the next bar shows with a bit orange, red, if you use the passive cooling measures to reduce load for space cooling and for cold chain, so this is cool roofs, this is insulation, ventilation, nature-based solutions, you can have a significant reduction in the emissions. And then, of course, the next bar shows you increasing the use of energy efficient technologies. And that includes fans, that includes combining fans with efficient air conditioners, that includes, district systems. And finally, of course, promoting a fast phase down of the HFC refrigerants. So taken together, these three pillars, passive cooling, energy efficiency, and fast action on HFCs, can help us deliver more than 60% of the reductions by 2050. And of course, cooling is mostly powered by electricity. So to get to near zero, what you see on this slide is you would have to then decarbonize the electricity grid to get to 96% reduction of emissions by 2050. Next slide, please. What's important is that this is not just about emissions. The benefits are quite significant to us in terms of electricity savings. It's trillions of dollars for consumers for having such a sustainable pathway and access to sustainable cooling. It's a reduction of peak load of basically what you see is up to 2 terawatts. That, just to give it context, is double EU's total generation capacity today in general. And that would allow us to avoid significant trillions of dollars in investments in power generation and grid infrastructure. And as I said, this comes at also being able to provide an additional 3 billion people with fridges or air conditioners or passively cooled buildings by 2050. Next slide. So action, to implement this pathway is growing, but not fast enough. And what you see here on the slide is about, around 3 out of 4 countries have adopted. Basically, over 80% of countries have adopted at least one policy to advance this pathway of sustainable cooling. But most of the actions remain fragmented. There's implementation challenges. And what's really important is that only a quarter, so around 27% of countries have actually implemented policies across the 3 pillars that enable us to deliver this pathway. So next slide, please. So that's where the Global Cooling Pledge comes in as an opportunity to scale action on these 3 key areas with available measures. The science of this report laid the foundation for the targets of the pledge, which you see on the screen. And these are really how you make this pathway happen. These are policy actions that every country can take to be on a pathway to keep its population cool and its food systems resilient and its infrastructure healthy while reducing emissions. So some of the most impactful policies are, incorporating passive cooling measures into building codes, that's shading or glazing. This is huge impact on sustainable cooling. On efficiency, it's, ratcheting minimum energy performance standards, making sure that you integrate refrigerant phase down criteria into these standards, and try to integrate that into building codes. And of course, fast phase down of HFCs. This is being done through the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, this and energy efficiency. And this is very important to continue to do, and, with gusto, if I can say it like that. And also with ensuring that there's life cycle management and training and skilling that allows this transition to be smooth and fast. And of course, we need the business models and the, deployment of financial instruments that that basically bring the savings that we can get from sustainable cooling in the business model to make it affordable for all. So this is what over 72 countries have committed to in the Global Cooling Pledge. It was launched at COP28. It had very strong leadership it has very strong leadership from the US. And I think that, and it continues to build. So next slide, please. We, on an annual basis, deliver a cooling ministerial where the countries actually come together to report on progress, to exchange on how they're acting on these different commitments and how they can support each other. So we have this on an annual basis at COP. We had one last year. We will have one again this year. So really tracking progress. There's a progress report that's delivered showcasing sort of leadership examples of how countries are moving on the global cooling pledge. Next slide, please. It also continues to be reinforced in the global political sphere. So it was reinforced by the G7 countries as an area that as a pledge that needs to be implemented. It was in efficient cooling was mentioned in the G20 outcome documents, and of course the Clean Energy Ministerial also puts a lot of emphasis on supporting the pledge from the energy aspect. Next slide, please. And so, just to give a quick glimpse on how the pledge signatories are doing, they're doing quite well on many areas. They're really leaders on implementing these commitments. But again, I think the emphasis is one of the big areas that lags is passive cooling. I think this is an area that is not being integrated enough and into the building codes. It's not being integrated into urban planning policies, the nature-based solutions. And then, of course, I think the life cycle management is also still of hydrofluorocarbons is still something that it needs to be strengthened. Next slide, please. And this is just to say that there's also work at the technical level with all the pledge signatories. So they meet on a biannual basis at the technical level, where there is discussions on there's training, there's exchange on policy, but also the coalition as a secretariat to the Global Cooling Pledge has set up the implementation mechanisms to support as well on some of the aspects of the pledge that are not currently supported under the Kigali Amendment. So for example, on the passive cooling aspects as mentioned, on national cooling plans, on NDCs, on these aspects. And we're also working very much to bring this into the climate discussion. So what's important to note is that the pledge signatories met this year back to back with the Bonn climate meetings. This was co-hosted with Germany, who hosts the Bonn sessions on climate, and really helping bridge the community to the climate community. And final slide. I think I want to end with just to say that there is a strong market opportunity here as well. So it's important to note this is about emissions, but there's also huge opportunities for economic growth and development. And in one of the reports we did with the International Finance Corporation, what you see is that the active cooling market, so air conditioners and refrigerations, is expected to grow in the global south from a $300 billion market to at least $600 billion per year by 2050. And this is important to note that this is a huge area of growth. And so we have a big opportunity ahead of us to come together and deliver this pathway of sustainable cooling. And thank you. Next slide. Thank you back over to you.
Yes, the official thank you slide. Lily, that was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Your slides were incredible. And for our online audience, just a reminder that all of our resources, including the presentation materials from today, are available on our website at www.eesi.org. So if you'd like to find Lily's slides and go through them with a little bit more detail, you're certainly welcome to do that. You can also go back and rewatch your presentation, and the same thing goes for our upcoming two panelists. And Lily, you are absolutely allowed to say gusto. We need more gusto all the way around these days. So that's certainly no problem. Next up, our second panelist is Shikha Bhasin. Shikha is a visiting fellow at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water and Partnerships Manager at the Clean Energy Ministerial. Shikha helped build the Sustainable Cooling and Climate Negotiations programs at CEEW and also represents them as steering committee member of the Research and Independent NGO Constituency, or RINGO, under the UNFCCC. a co-author of the India Cooling Action Plan and coordinating author of the UNEP Global Cooling Watch Report that Lily just mentioned. Shikha has been actively engaged in developing and advancing the policy ecosystem for sustainable cooling, particularly on advising the Global Cooling Pledge implementation, research and development, hydrofluorocarbons, regulations, and philanthropic strategies. Shikha, thank you so much for joining our panel today. Turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and a big hello to everybody who's joined us this morning to talk about something that I can easily say with the three women that are at least online on my screen is really, really close to our heart. And we're glad that EESI is creating the space for all of you to be able to hear a little bit more about it. As Daniel mentioned, I'm with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, but I'm also with the OECD's Clean Energy Ministerial. But today I'm speaking in a more personal capacity with the work that I've done on cooling over the last 9 to 10 years, I'd like to say. If we could maybe get my slides up, I could then get started.
They can outsource it to wider like women in renewables.
Thank you. So I wanted to actually use these 10 minutes that I have with you to talk a little bit about how cooling actually came to come on to the global stage, right? And Lily's spoken to you a little bit about where we are today and how important it is that we all act on cooling. But for almost 25 years now, if I could have the next slide, the entire space of cooling was not known to us as a space of cooling when it came to be a multilateral priority. This year, in fact, is the 40th year of something called the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer. And so we started with this 40 years ago, talking about cooling by talking about refrigerants, because those are the gases that get used in our cooling appliances. So whether that's your air conditioners in your offices, homes, factories, whether that's your freezers that keep your medical and industrial facilities up and running, or whether that's refrigerators that allow for food to, move through the cold chain that gets our food into our markets and our homes. All of this actually was being tackled by the Vienna Convention because of what you all may remember as the ozone layer hole that we started noticing above the Arctic and the Antarctic. So the Vienna Convention came into being. It is touted to be the most successful environmental, some say the most successful treaty globally, because it enabled action to move away from these set of gases that were causing the ozone layer to break up, and enabled action for all countries globally, 197 countries actually, to switch away from these ozone depleting refrigerants towards hydrofluorocarbons, which were not going to be harming the ozone layer any longer. But about 25 years ago, scientists started to discover that these ozone-friendly gases were actually really, really harmful for global warming. So to give you an example, at a molecular level, they are thousands of times more potent than carbon dioxide, which is supposed to be the big bad enemy that we all recognize for global warming. So there was a treaty that again started to get negotiated by way of an amendment. Lily referred to the Kigali Amendment. And it is this amendment that again tackled this new set of refrigerants, and the world is now seeing a transition towards what we now call the HFOs or the hydrocarbons, which are also natural refrigerants. Now, this new and improved technology, which actually takes us back to our ancient forms of refrigerants, are both ozone friendly and climate friendly. And so we have a winner, at least for the time being. And it is through action on these cooling refrigerants that the world really started to talk about cooling within the international negotiation space. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, when we were talking about the appliances, the focus remained very much on appliances, right? So how do we increase access to appliances? How do we make sure that the industry and the supply chains are ready to move towards this new set of refrigerants? Do we have enough investment going into the R&D for these refrigerants? What is the supply chain going to look like? So on and so forth. And it was after quite a bit of heavy-handed negotiations that happened back in 2016 that the Kigali Amendment came to be. And in yet another way, it proved itself to be a really innovative and useful platform for international negotiations, because for the first time, this treaty actually created space for a third track of commitments to happen. Usually when we look to our environmental treaties, we see a developed country cohort and we see a less developed country cohort, and the negotiations usually run between these two groups of countries, and, some emerge winners and the others not as much. And that's how agreements come to be. But in this particular case, all countries agreed to a global limit that they wanted to achieve by a set target date. But the starting points and the rate at which that decline would happen, they differentiated between stages of development and the temperatures and the ambient conditions of certain countries. And so it proved itself successful in making sure that everyone comes to the same page eventually, even if the starting points are going to be a little bit different. And the reason that this is really important to point out is because while it was looking at a technology transition, essentially, because you're moving away from one set of refrigerants to another, as a co-benefit, the amendment will actually allow for almost 0.5 degrees of global warming to be averted once these commitments are met up to the end of the century. And already, as a co-benefit from the previous set of refrigerants that we've deviated away from, it's already contributed to actually mitigating or avoiding quite a significant level of degrees Celsius increase in our, for our planet. So while it focuses on specific technologies, the impact that it's had globally when it comes to emissions and climate warming has been immense. And there's one other thing that I would like to table here with you, because it's important for us to recognize that while the starting points have been different and the negotiation commitment schedules across countries were different, we're already seeing between 2016 and 2025, market reality has shifted significantly. So even the countries that fought really hard to have a slower start in their phase down schedules are today countries that are actually leading the global cooling pledge. And I'm speaking about UAE here, which has been such a huge champion in getting the global cooling pledge off the table. Countries like India, which actually needs to start its phase down, I want to say by 2028, more than half of its market is already reflecting these changes without the government having to come heavy-handedly on its industries to do so. So, there's a lot to be said about signaling for industries and investments in that direction, but also global leadership that gets picked up by the most unsuspecting of countries. Maybe we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So once this international agreement had been put on the table and everyone knew where they wanted to go, it was time to come back home and start thinking about, all right, what does this technology change really mean and how do we go about implementing it? And as it so happens, I was lucky enough to be working in India at the time at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. And this entire notion of wanting to see research and development and a supply chain reform in this particular technology and the appliances that would then be made available for people to buy, we decided to take a step back with the government of India and really think about India's development trajectory and the rising heat, the rising incomes, and the rising urban middle classes. We knew that cooling and the demand for these appliances was going to skyrocket, as Lily also alluded to in her presentation. And so when you're thinking about this increase in the demand for cooling, the conversation domestically very quickly became about cooling and not about appliances and refrigerant change for those appliances. And so that was really the genesis of the first cooling action plan that came to be, because it was thinking about meeting this big global target, wanting to make sure that countries like India were a part of the solution, and were contributing proactively to getting to that target, but also thinking about how we could leverage that as a target to really try and move the needle on development and ensuring, a rise above from poverty and a better quality of life for the growing middle classes and the ones who are most vulnerable to heat stress domestically. And so it was a group of, this was led by the Ministry of Environment within India, and we were a bunch of think tankers, university researchers, professors, sectoral experts, private sector, industry associations, and just as importantly, all of the ministries that in some ways are connected to cooling. This entire group of stakeholders actually came together to start thinking about cooling as a whole, which so far had really been thought about, in the silos of energy efficiency, or in the silos of appliance manufacturing, or in the silos of refrigerant transition. And this, in a sense, I'm really happy to say, became the blueprint for how other countries then started to think about cooling more holistically. So between 2019, which is when the first cooling action plan, which was India's, was launched, to 2022, we saw more than 40 national cooling action plans emerge. And Lily's team actually did an incredible job in sort of blueprinting what India had done and creating a systematic methodology that others could follow through with. And I'm really happy to say that her team, several of whom are my friends, are actually in the process of developing and publishing such cooling action plans for a vast majority of countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia, where the heat really hurts. And so we've seen that by taking this approach, the silos of refrigerants, of energy efficiency, energy security, energy access, cooling access, ensuring productivity and wellness of populations, gets established in a way that at least people are thinking about it holistically. Unfortunately, we're not quite where everyone is acting on it as holistically, but I think that's where initiatives like the Global Cooling Pledge have such a critical role to play, because they really try and bring that sensibility that cuts across your ministries of agriculture, which looks at cold chain, to the Ministry of Energy, which is looking at energy efficiency, to your Ministry of Environment, which is looking at your refrigerants, but also the industry, manufacturing sectors, as well as your labor productivity ministries. And so this is really a special moment where we've seen, from 40 years ago, what started as a technology transition to today, talking about a global narrative and an entire political movement of almost 80 countries that are thinking and talking about creating systems within their own regulatory frameworks that will enable action that are good for the planet and good for their people. In India, what happened with the Cooling Action Plan since its inception has also been very interesting. I've already spoken to you about how the market has already moved the needle on the refrigerants that needed to be transitioned. But we also saw the Department of Industry and Trade Promotion in India recognizing air conditioners as almost a sunrise industry. So they noticed that, if the demand is going to be so much, why are we not looking at using this as a way to give gusto to our industrial production systems, So you saw an entire trade-linked policy get developed within India, in addition to, of course, the genesis of a solid cold chain, policy and program come into being. We've seen a lot of service sector investments being made, because with the increase in air conditioners and appliances, there is going to be a simultaneous increase also in the people who need to install and service it. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that in just a minute. But I wanted to use this time with you to sort of showcase that cooling is not a sector in and of itself in the way that we speak of it. It's a sector that cuts across very, very, very diverse sectors and responsible agencies. And it is really been about, it's been a lot of effort from a lot of people within government and outside of government to get the narrative around cooling to come together in the way that today we're speaking about the Global Cooling Pledge, and the way that we're seeing it get implemented in different countries. Next slide, please. So given that we have now gotten here, that we are today being able to talk about cooling as a whole, which requires a whole of government approach. Lily highlighted some of the policies that exist across the countries, and we see that there is political sensibility around it, but we also know that a lot of actors need to come together. I want to leave you with just 3 very key issues that remain to be solved as we continue to try and canvas for this whole of government approach to impact passive cooling and energy efficiency, as well as refrigerants. And the first one is life cycle refrigerant management. Now, this is during the course of the refrigerant operation, we need to make sure that we're preventing leakages, and we need to make sure that we're creating business models that enable recovery at the end of the life. Because in most markets, what happens at the end of the life is that you just leak the refrigerants out into the air and hope that no one notices. And this is a huge emissions opportunity. In India alone, we're talking about 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Globally, it's 91 billion tons of an opportunity that we're talking about. And this speaks a lot also to business investments and the kind of business models we see coming in, because one of the ways that it's really being regulated so far in a few countries is through the use of carbon credits and carbon markets. And that again speaks to why this is important ahead of COP for you to hear. The second aspect is a service sector readiness. And the reason this is important for me to highlight over here is because when we're talking about cooling, we're not just talking about the demand for cooling and servicing that demand for cooling. We're also talking about creating a lot of new jobs, whether that's in manufacturing, whether that's in installation, or whether that's in repairs and maintenance. In India, this is going to reach 3 million by 2047. That's a big number just for India. And then the final piece, which is about the transitioning of finance, right? So we've learned to operate energy efficiency incentives. We've learned to support countries in their refrigerant transition. What we've not learned that well to do so far, and this is where whole of government approaches and multilateral groups become important, is how do we create projects that align all of these different silos of cooling operation? How do we bring them together so that we're actually able to advance the cooling agenda in countries that are looking to do this? And we see that there is political leadership. There's 72 countries that Lily mentioned. I know that once the project financing windows get opened, we'll probably see 172 countries line up for it. And so this is the piece that I wanted to leave you with, in that it's jobs, it's about business models, and it's about creating systems that benefit your economy, your livelihoods, not just the people who need cooling the most. Thanks very much. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Shikha. And anyone in our audience, if you were thinking about just releasing refrigerants into the atmosphere and hoping no one notices, please don't. Give a hoot. Don't pollute. Shikha, I'm glad you mentioned jobs. We actually did a briefing a little bit earlier this year that featured a company that does a lot of work in this space, Daikin US. And so anyone who wants to learn about their approach to US manufacturing, that briefing is available online. We have had a ton of information presented so far. We're going to get even more when we turn to our third panelist. If anyone in our online audience has any questions, maybe we can put the Mentimeter code and QR code up on the screen. You can also send us an email, and that email address to use is ask, that's ASK, at EESI.org. Maybe we'll leave that up while I introduce our third panelist. We're already getting questions coming in, and they're interesting, so we'll do our best to get to them. Our third panelist today is Helen Walter-Terrinoni. Helen is the Global Director of Policy and Advocacy for Trane Technologies. She works at the crossroads of sustainability and policy. She's led transitions in technology, manufacturing, and business, including how low global warming potential refrigerant development, supply chain management, environmental mitigation, hazardous process safety, and strategic planning. She has worked in the refrigeration, foams, and environmental space for nearly 30 years. She is a co-chair of the UN Montreal Protocol Foams Technical Options Committee and a member of the Technical and Economic Assessment Panel, although she's not necessarily representing their views on our panel today. Helen, thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to see you. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Dan, and appreciate being here. You can go to the next slide. So I work for Trane Technologies, and for those of you that don't know Trane Technologies, it is the largest heating and cooling and energy services company in the world. We have over 40,000 employees, over 20 3,000 in the US alone, over 25 manufacturing sites in the United States. And 4,000 of those employees in the US are technicians, and we have hundreds of distribution centers. So we kind of work through the value chain. So we have a very unique view and perspective around the practical matters related to refrigerants and cooling and how that all works. So you can see on the screen here a little bit more detail around some of our product spaces. So commercial air conditioning as well as residential and transport refrigeration, including very, very low temperature transport for medicine and peroxides and so on, blood plasma. And then life sciences is kind of a new part of our world, as is BrainBox, so an AI controls setup. Just wanted to kind of share that, Dan. We can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So Shikha talked a little bit about this today. This long global history of harmonizing policy in coordination with stakeholders. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy space and then some of the practical matters of implementation of policies related to this space. So Shikha certainly mentioned, kind of talked about the ozone layer a little bit, and that protects us all from skin cancer. The ozone layer is slated to heal by 2060-ish timeframe as a result of the success of the Montreal Protocol. So 2 phase outs and now a phase down under Kigali. So the 10-year anniversary of the Kigali Amendment is next year. I was lucky enough to be there, and I'm actually at Montreal Protocol meetings today. You can go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about how why industry was really supportive of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. I think people started to see a developing patchwork of policies around the world. So you can see here on this graph a schedule on the right-hand side, which is the agreement under the Kigali Amendment. It's also the under the legislation of the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, which is the implementing legislation for the Kigali Amendment. But you can see lines in yellow that precede that, and that's in the European Union when they started to mandate phase down of refrigerants, of hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, earlier than was agreed upon by the Kigali Amendment. And so companies began to have to transition at that time. It was pretty chaotic, honestly, and people were a little bit unprepared, and so I think people were started to look for order. On the next slide, if you don't mind to go to that, we also started to see emerging policies around the U.S. So in different states started to have refrigerant transition requirements. Now, if you're just making widgets and you're going to make widget A or widget B, it doesn't really much matter what the policy says. So we started to see states take action. And if you're just making widgets, so some product A and some product B, and you're balancing your supply chain, you can make more of A or more of B if you need to kind of manage that supply chain. But if you are using 2 different refrigerants, then you've actually got to make the same product, the same piece of equipment to manage both types of refrigerants. And so you've got double the manufacturing investment that you need to kind of to compensate for that. And so American industry, kind of works with others to enact the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, the AIM Act. And that became the implementing legislation for the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. And because of this patchwork that was kind of developing around the country, creating more cost and more challenges for supply chains. So the AIM Act, it requires the phase down of supply as required by the Kigali Amendment of HFCs. And it also allows EPA to set technology transition dates and global warming potential limits, and kind of kickstart those transitions in a very, very orderly way. I talked about Europe and how that was a little bit chaotic. EPA tried to work things and schedule things to be more orderly. They also are authorized to create a refrigerant management policy. So Shikha talked a little bit about refrigerant end-of-life management, but there's also refrigerant leak reduction, so that saves money, but also it reduces emissions overarchingly. And so EPA has set out these 3 rules. In 2023, they set out a technology transition rule. In 2022, a phase down framework, as well as allocation for suppliers. And then they implemented a refrigerant management rule in 2024. So that was all in implementing the phase down, and it helps to comport with the ratified treaty. So if you don't mind, go to the next slide. So this is just kind of a little bit of a view of refrigerant management. So refrigerant is kind of recovered out of equipment, and then it can be reused or it can be destroyed. And so, this is how, this is kind of the basic nuts and bolts of how we think about this kind of around the world. And this is more difficult or easier depending on the country you're in, and whether or not, there is enabling equipment available, enabling training available, enabling infrastructure available for this reverse supply chain. So just wanted to make mention of this from a practical perspective. And if we don't mind to go to, I think this may be my last slide, Dan. So, but I'm gonna go ahead. You can go to the next slide. But I did want to make mention of a couple of other things. So there are several activities that are needed to enable the transition to new refrigerants. Some of those things are training for technicians, and there has been a tremendous amount of research and work done to develop training guidelines and requirements, and to enable kind of success for technicians around the world. And those are things that kind of can be shared through this cooling pledge network. Those very simple nuts and bolts requirements are part of the puzzle pieces that kind of can go together for countries to kind of share information and benefit from, and this, the countries that have kind of gone first can share it with countries that are moving later. And those are some of the important pieces of the puzzle. I would also mention, just a couple of the other features, building a little bit on what Shikha and Lily talked about around reducing energy use, so reducing energy load and increasing energy efficiency. Those are elements of the cooling pledge that can save families money all around the world, including the United States. Passive cooling measures, as well as can kind of help to beat the heat, as well as certainly to save money, as well as infrastructure in the grid. So lots of different benefits from the concepts that have been raised in the cooling pledge, not only for countries around the world, but also kind of being adopted in the United States. So wanted to make mention of that, Dan, since we're talking about folks here at home, around how this can and has been implemented here, and how this idea sharing has really taken hold and is really creating benefits around the world.
All right, Helen, you can turn your camera back on. I think
Okay.
We'll be okay for the Q&A. Those were tremendous presentations. The 3 of you, I would say, know a lot about global cooling, and that's always interesting to learn about a topic like this. And we love energy efficiency and things like that here at EESI. So we have a few minutes. We got started a little late because we had an audio issue, so we'll probably spill over the 1 o'clock hour just a little bit, but we do have some time for questions. And the question I'd like to start with, and Lily, maybe we could start with you and then hear from Shikha and from Helen as well. And there are some audience questions that I would like to get to as well. But the first question I'd like to start with is just where could these topics surface at COP30? Like what outcomes, and where in the course of COP30 happening is this likely to pop up, and what are the kinds of outcomes U.S. decision makers on the public sector side, but the private sector side as well, what kind of outcomes could they be looking for?
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for that question. I think, well, the COP30 presidency has really been focusing on moving from sort of, they're really focused on implementation, and they're very focused on heat as an issue, extreme heat, rising temperatures as an issue, and how to adapt to that. In this context, they are one of the signatories of the Global Cooling Pledge, and they are the chair of the pledge this year. So countries rotate as the chair. And in this context, they are they are spearheading an initiative that is looking at localizing the pledge. And what does that mean? That means exactly where Helen left off, let's say, is where I can pick up. It means delivering cooling where it matters most in homes, in our communities, through nature-based solutions that can reduce temperatures significantly while also reducing energy demand. It means through, as I said, cool roofs, better surfaces, better building design, better urban planning. It means thinking about where is the heat risk in our communities, mapping that out and identifying where we should prioritize cooling solutions, making sure critical infrastructure is resilient, so on and so forth. So this is under the frame, what's called Beat the Heat. It's an implementation drive. And what it does is the presidency has asked all the 72 countries to come forward with cities that they would work with that would champion these efforts at the local level. So it's looking at national to local implementation, looking at states, regions, and cities where the heat hits us the most and who have the most power to deploy these passive solutions. So that will come up as a presidency priority and will be discussed on the margins of COP. There will be a presidency event on 11th of November where this will be presented. There will be a cooling ministerial on the 18th where this will be presented. And I think that in the whole course of discussion on adaptation and resilience to heat, these solutions will be presented, because cooling is always, we speak a lot about emissions, but cooling is also about adaptation, and it's also about resilience. So I think that for the policymakers, I think it's really important to track the negotiations and the discussions on cooling in the context of adaptation and resilience. I think this is really important. Yeah.
Shikha, I'd love to thank you, Lily. That was great. Shikha, I'd love to give you an opportunity to chime into about where and sort of what contexts this issue could pop up over the course of the negotiations.
Yes, I think maybe a couple of more additions to what Lily's already shared. I would think that Article 6, which looks at carbon markets, that would be an interesting one, because as I mentioned, cooling is a burgeoning sector. There's, a lot of growth expected in investments, but also in business models, in the way cooling is being made accessible to people. So I would think that Article 6 would be an important one for people to keep an eye out on. So cooling would not necessarily feature in the conversation, but it's a really relevant piece of negotiation that would also apply to people who are interested in making investments and leveraging that momentum politically. And I think a second place, and this is not necessarily a COP area, just a COP area, would be the just transitions, which speaks very closely or sits very closely to adaptation and resilience. But it is about livelihoods. It is about, job creation in clean energy, clean tech sectors. So that's another space where I think people need to be thinking about cooling more systematically. And then completely outside of the COP framework, in the multilateral spaces beyond COP and the Montreal Protocol, where Helen's at right now, I would like to position that the growing attention on energy security means that cooling is something that a lot of governments and people are thinking about, because it's expected by 2040, I think, to go up to almost 40% of electricity consumption globally. So it's the largest growth sector after industry when it comes to electricity consumption, and it's projected to go in that way in a business as usual manner. So I think wherever countries are sitting around talking about energy security, which is pretty much every country around the world today, cooling is something that they need to be paying attention to and will be paying attention to.
Thanks, Shikha. And Helen, what do you think? Where will some of these topics pop up, and what outcomes should policymakers be looking for?
I think a couple of different things yet. So, we're going to see NDCs, so nationally determined contributions, updated, right? And so we will see more emphasis there. But certainly this Beat the Heat campaign, as going to be so important. And as we think about kind of local policies emerging, we've seen, proposals around the US around just requiring like health classes to teach about higher temperatures and exposure to heat, as well as, limiting temperatures in apartment buildings and in schools, so that kids can learn and you don't have to shut the school down when the temperature gets too hot. And so we're starting to see these kind of eclectic little things happening around cooling and the need for cooling and access to cooling. I think as well, I like to say that the cheapest electron that I can get from an energy perspective is the one I don't use, right? And the fastest electron I can get is the one my neighbor doesn't use, right? So if we think about, the intertwining of energy efficiency with cooling and how important that is, because as Shikha mentioned, this is such an area of growth around the world. That the infrastructure and the cost of the infrastructure for the grid as energy demand grows will be phenomenal, and it may not be something that we can all keep up with financially. And so I think that reducing energy load, reducing energy use, all of those features are things that we need to keep in front of us as we think about beating the heat at COP in maybe a little bit of a broader term.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned that because, yeah, when that infrastructure has to be built, it's not like there's a money tree somewhere that those, at least in the United States, at least that has to be recovered from ratepayers, and it's that cost is not nothing. That kind of leads us to a question that came in from the audience that I think is very interesting. Speaking of the cost of keeping the grid operational, this question is about data centers. In the US, at least, there's a lot of conversation about sort of how we manage data center proliferation and the increases in energy demand that are being projected for the grid. In the estimates that you all are working with for the, is an increase in demand for data center cooling part of this conversation? Is that something that you might expect to be addressed at COP? I don't know who the right person is to address that, but we'll make it a free-for-all. But I think that's a great question.
Do you want me to start since we
Helen,
work in the place? Okay, yeah. So I think, this is a little bit of a nascent conversation, unbelievably, right? Because who couldn't have seen this coming, right? But it's a little bit of a nascent conversation. And, there is a shift of focus in technologies from kind of, let's cool the whole room where the air, where the equipment is, to kind of cooling a smaller section, down to the chip even, from a liquid cooling perspective. And as we think about changing technologies to reduce energy use and being able to keep higher temperatures around computer chips, etc., the puzzle that we're going to hear about while we're at COP, I think. But I think other pieces of the puzzle are, we've seen in the US alone, data centers go offline and the grid slams down. We've seen the other way where so much uptake and,
while we're reestablishing Helen's connection, Lily, I saw your hand first, but we'll definitely come back to you, Shikha. Go ahead, Lily.
No, I just want to say that, yes, we do account for data center demand growth, the demand of cooling in the numbers that I presented. And that's why, maybe I didn't spell it out clear on the data centers, but it is part of the sort of keeping our economies prosperous angle that I mentioned at the very beginning. So it is actually accounted for in our numbers, and it is going to have a huge impact. And that's why, we increasingly look at cooling as, we have a new global watch that will be released at COP. So that's one of the things that will be released. And there we look at the impact of extreme heat on rising demand. And we also break it down a bit further on these kind of trends that you just mentioned, the data centers. So I don't want to give too much away because it's embargoed, but basically, I think just to say it's accounted for. And also that's why we really want to refer to cooling as almost as critical infrastructure alongside water, energy, because if like what Helen is saying, you have a breakdown of it's too hot and your data center can't function, or there's not enough, these things stop the whole digital economy. So cooling becomes really vital from that perspective, in addition to the schools and the health centers and hospitals. So, and one thing I didn't mention when we spoke about COP was there is a cooling and buildings pavilion that we host at COP, where it's creating a space for all the technical discussions, such as on data centers, and there will be those discussions. And I know that Helen will also be there, and these discussions will be had throughout the entire 2 weeks, alongside the negotiations. And many of the negotiators will be participating in this pavilion and the discussion. So please, we'll share the resource. Please feel free to track that and the discussions there as well. Yeah, over to you.
Shikha, we'll give you the last word, but Helen, you cut out for a second. If you had a conclusion to your thought, I'm happy to turn back to you, and then we'll wrap things up with Shikha's comments.
That's fine, and sorry about that. A little bit of bumpy connectivity here. So I don't know where we left off. So I'm going to put a little plug in. We have an extreme heat report, so a heat wave readiness report coming out next week that we'll be launching, and so that will be at the Global ABC, the Buildings and Cooling Pavilion as well, and so a little plug there.
Great, always good plugs. Shikha, I think this might mean you get our last word today. You can choose to address data centers. You can also share any other concluding thoughts, but I'll turn it over to you.
I think it's a really pertinent question, and one that, from what you heard from Lily and Helen, and I'm going to reiterate that it is something that we're all grappling with. But there was actually an IEA report, which actually hosts the Clean Energy Ministerial, which I work at, which brought out the assessment of electricity consumption from data centers. And while a majority of the electricity will, of course, go towards servers, depending on the efficiency of the cooling system and the data center, almost 30% of the electricity consumption within a data center will be because of cooling, right? So the most efficient that they've seen is about 7%, but that's really quite a few in number, but it does go up to almost 30% for the less efficient data centers that are there. And it is something that people in the US, people in Western Europe in general, and in Eastern Europe are also starting to think about, because it's something that hasn't been modeled, quite as much as, say, space cooling and cold chain has. So I think for developing countries, the big conundrum is going to be, how do we tackle emissions from cooling for cold chain, because these are systems you can't switch off. And I think for the developed or early industrialized countries, it will be about data centers, because again, these are systems you can't switch off.
Thank you so much, Lily and Shikha and Helen, for joining us from all over the world. This is maybe our most globally geographically diverse panel I've ever had at EESI. So thank you so much for joining us, and really appreciate your presentations. Good luck for the next couple weeks, keeping up with everything. And Helen, I think you'll be traveling there. So safe travels from Kenya to Brazil. Maybe you're stopping in the US on your way, since it's kind of on the way. But this has been a great panel. Thank you so much. Speaking of, Helen was making a plug. I'll make a plug. We did a briefing earlier this year on extreme heat resilience with the Federation of American Scientists. And that talked a lot about local solutions, kind of to some of the points that came up. So if you want to learn a little bit about how some states and localities in the US are dealing with extreme heat, that would be a great additional resource. So thanks to our panelists. Thanks also to my EESI colleagues, Dan O, Amory, Allison, Hannah, Anna, Nicole, Laura, and Miguel, for all of their hard work pulling off the session today. We also have great interns, Haley and Olivia, who are doing lots of work behind the scenes, and Troy, the videographer, our videographer, who makes all of this look so nice. So thank you, Troy, as well. We have one more briefing in our series this week. We hope to see you online tomorrow for our third briefing, a discussion about international trade and climate policy. And given what the arguments the Supreme Court was hearing apparently earlier today, international trade is something that's certainly on a U.S. domestic policymaker's mind. So we'll really eager to dig into that conversation as well. Please subscribe to COP30 Dispatch to get daily updates curated for a congressional staff audience. We'll also have resources like articles and trackers, the report that Helen was just talking about, some of the other reports that Lily and Shikha were referencing as well. Those are things that we keep track of, and also who from the United States in an official capacity is traveling to Brazil. So we have a lot of really great resources to help keep up with everything over the next couple weeks. And if you're a congressional staff person in our audience, we'll be in touch with you about some additional staff-only resources that we have to offer. We'll also do a rapid readout or maybe rapid recap the week of Thanksgiving, but before Thanksgiving, to help people make sense of where COP30 ended up. We put the slide back up on the screen here with a link to our survey and a QR code. If you have a minute or two to take our survey, let us know what you thought of our session today. If you have any additional ideas, we read every response and we really appreciate the time that people take to make them. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great Wednesday, and we'll see you back at noon Eastern tomorrow for our look at international trade and climate policy. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.